preparedness here on USA Emergency Broadcasting Network. We are live 4 p.m. Central Time, 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Mondays, and our show goes to podcast on our 24-hour radio stream. You can see that, or listen to that, I should say, at our main site, www.usaebn.org. My name is Andre, and I'll be your host this week and every week for SitPrep, or situational preparedness. And that, I don't know, Nancy, if you've heard anything about that film or
I got a
or
chance
seen
to
it.
see it. I went on Friday, the day it was open, quick before the kids were out of school, and I was thrilled with how realistic it was, not sci-fi, but very realistic. For instance, they show the San Andreas ripping, where the ground heaves up on one side and drops on another, and there's a separation, a big crack or scar in the land. Well, that actually exists. You can fly an airplane over the San Andreas fault line, and you can see where that, and there's one place near San Francisco where it went through a fence, and the fence, there's on one side is 20 foot further north than the other. That this actually happens. And the size of the quakes, in 1906 we had, I'm not sure if it was at 8 or 9 or if they're even sure what it was, but it was a big one, and it shook San Francisco virtually to dust. Anywhere where there was liquefaction, all the buildings fell down, and the only ones that really stood were the ones up on Nob Hill where they were on granite. The granite would shake, but liquefaction is what destroys building, where that's where it goes. It's jiggling because of the water in the soil, and this was very realistic. It had the buildings, the shaking, the repeat, earthquakes. It's not usually just one big one. You have smaller ones, and then you have a big one, and then you have aftershocks. And this movie dramatized that. It showed how concrete buildings, or those with fascia, how the fascia, the mortar or whatever, falls off really quickly and drops on people on the street. That's absolutely what happens. And brick, a mortar or whatever, it's all going to fly every which way. One thing that does hold up are steel buildings, because the steel will flex. And they showed that in this movie in San Francisco. The building that stood at the end, other than its foundation eroding, where the rock it stands on may be tilting, or that type of thing, where the foundation would cause the building to lean and fall over, that steel structure is going to stand. And another thing I learned when I was out in California was that wooden buildings, plain old frame buildings, will also hold up pretty well in earthquakes. They flex, and unlike mortar or brick, which will shatter. So there's a lot of ways you can retrofit your house. I was very interested in all of that. I was out in California about 15 years ago after the Loma Prieta, 1989. And there's a wonderful book called Peace of Mind in Earthquake Country that teaches you how to retrofit your house, like put in diagonal X's with 2x4s in various places. And make sure your house is connected to the foundation stones so that it doesn't just fly off the foundation. Very practical and inexpensive fixes like that. So I was really pleased. In particular, I was very pleased to hear that they brought up the concept of being able to predict earthquakes with what they called the magnetics. And they don't explain what this is. In the movie, they show these two scientists, who have this theory, and they take their laptops to the Hoover Dam, which has a big quake and cracks and breaks, and then they go back to L.A. and say the magnetics did predict it. It was rising just ahead of the quake, and then they see the magnetics rising, in L.A., but they don't. So the implication is that they get these magnetics from the surrounding area, from the rock or the surrounding area, not from outer space or anything like that, because they're running around with their little laptops. and wherever they are is where they're recording the magnetics. Well, guess what? There is something that when rock is under pressure, it squeezes the air out of it, and the electric currents that are normal everywhere, right? Electric and magnetic currents can traverse through the rock, through the water that is trapped in the rock. In other words, normally there's a lot of air pockets in that acts as insulation, which blocks the electric and magnetic currents. But when the rock is under pressure, the air pockets are squeezed out, and then you have, all the way up. So you can have rock emitting electromagnetic properties, in increase in those wavelengths ahead of an earthquake. Well, guess what? When I was out in San Francisco in 1989, just after the Loma Prieta, which was like a 7.9, I believe, in Santa Cruz. And I was very curious to ask people their experiences. How they were driving across a bridge and all of a sudden they were in a different lane. Boop, just like that. Earthquakes will throw you. Or where their cups would come out of the cupboard and just stand there in the air and then drop. Well, the cups don't move, the house moves, and the cups stay still. Yeah, and these fascinating stories. So I learned that people who were driving by the epicenter in Santa Cruz, 2 days, in the 2 days ahead of that quake, could not bring radio stations in. The static was so bad. The static. And there you are with the electromagnetic current flow, and in fact, people experiment with this, and they dig little holes, and they put things down in the holes, and they're able to check this, folks. If you're concerned about your area, get into this and make your own earthquake predictor along these lines. If you're a little bit handy. And maybe it could even be a high school project. It works.
Right. I think, too, that, the electromagnetic properties of the Earth, obviously we are a magnetic planet because we have a spinning iron core, and that creates electromagnetic field that goes through all of the rocks, as you said. But also, it's not only the radio interference that comes as a precursor to major earthquakes, too, that there's also lights that are emitted, too, Nancy.
Yeah.
The Escanaba lights in Michigan are an example of that. And so that there are things out there that tell us that there are things coming. So and I'm glad that was addressed in the movie.
Yeah. And another thing I was pleased to see is that they were mentioning that river bottoms are a particularly weak place in the crust. And most people just think, well, a valley is a valley and a hill is a hill, but not so. Water drains down there because it's the low point, and that's why the river drains there. But why is it a low point? Because it's a thin crust, and it's drooping. And therefore, in this particular movie, the scientists referred to it as a deformation in the crust and said that it could even be considered a fault line or a plate border or murmuring along those lines. Well, in fact, get to know your geology. If you're along river bottoms, like the New Madrid runs up along the Mississippi, well, there you are. The Mississippi, from all the way down to where it empties into the Gulf, all the way up towards Chicago, that's where, the New Madrid is first going to take off. So therefore, get to know your geology along those. A very educational movie. I was very, very happy. By the way, talking about earthquake predictors,
sure.
You know that the Chinese use Peking ducks as predictors. And there was a Jim Bergdahl, I think his name is, on the West Coast, who predicts earthquakes and talks about scanning the newspapers for pets that have run away from home. Missing pet, this is Fluffy's description, and she ran, the number of missing pets skyrockets just ahead of an earthquake. Why is this? Because they listen to that flow of electrons and magnetons, and it's built in to that animal to say, I better get away from this area. I better run away from this. And you know, they try to do that. They try to escape the earthquake. Well, Peking ducks are very sensitive to this, according to the Chinese. And if they get all flappy, you know, everybody takes their crockery out of the cupboards and sleeps outside or whatever. Well, I had 10 years ago some ducks, and I had one, Mildred, and she was great at predicting. So we had a 4.5 in Chicago, which is just 150 miles south of me. And for the 2 days ahead of that 4.5, I could not. She was inconsolable. Quack, 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 quack. Running around, running and quacking, and I would sing her songs, and I would hold her, and I would try to say, nothing calmed her. But then we had the quake down there. I didn't even feel it up here. I mean, nothing fell over. But she immediately settled down. That was it.
Right after the quake, right. She settled down?
Yes.
Really?
The tension was relieved, and she was fine.
So what you're saying is you had a duck. Let me just clarify this for everybody. You had a duck that had quake quacks.
Yes.
Before the 4.5. Now this one wasn't the recent 4 that we had about a month and a half ago. This was a while ago, a couple of years ago, right?
10 years ago. I don't have the ducks anymore, but it was the 2 days ahead of that quake, and likewise out in California, it was the 2 days ahead of the Loma Prieta that the man reported to me that he could not, driving past Santa Cruz, he couldn't bring radio stations in, you know, on his car radio.
From the radio interference.
That's right. That's right. That's all you need is 2 days. Get out of the house. Sleep in a tent. Yep.
Right, because folks out there, for those of you who are looking at preparedness for earthquakes and readiness for earthquakes, the science behind predicting earthquakes is pretty complex, but the animal factor seems to be pretty solid. One comment from Karen in the chat room, she lives out on the West Coast, her dog throws up before earthquakes. So dogs especially and smaller animals are very, very sensitive to those low-level vibrations as well as the electromagnetic, I hate to say pulse, it's really not a pulse, it's just a field that it changes, and these small animals are very sensitive to that. And if you can see that and then put together, you know, your feelings, some people get the feelings too, but like the radio interference over the FM or AM radio, there's also sometimes these quakes come in swarms, which are multiple events all clustered in the same area, not to be confused with a major earthquake followed by preceded by a foreshock and an aftershock, which are basically on the same epicenter. But not to get too off into it, but it's when you're preparing for earthquakes, it's really you need to protect yourself from flying debris, much like you would a tornado, except the debris would be flying from buildings and, you know, things falling over and sinkholes and cracks opening up in the earth. So if you can get to an open area, flat ground, and if you don't have anything to protect you, such as a helmet or, you know, something to get under to protect yourself from falling debris, such as bricks or broken glass or anything else, and, you know, telephone poles will be falling down, that sort of thing. Get into an open area and get low enough to the ground so if you fall down, you're not going to get hurt, and wait for the shaking to stop. But we saw in Nepal, Nancy, too, that some of these aftershocks come multiple weeks after, several days after. People have been sleeping outside for weeks, and that, you know, there's not a whole lot you can do. The Earth is going to move when she wants to move, and it's up to you to protect yourself. So some of these what we call precursors are something like, okay, that's a heads up. You might have a day, you might have 15 hours, you might have 2 days. So get ready, be able to go outside, get low to the ground, get away from falling debris. That's the quickest answer. Get out of earthquake country is a better answer. Get to a safe location. But, you know, when some of these things happen very quickly, so.
Yeah. Good advice. Get a duck.
Get it done. Yeah,
but
quick
I know
cracker.
a lot of pets are very, and people have aches and pains, and they've learned that they are an earthquake predictor, and that's very helpful too. And there are people who post online. I think there's forums, where people say, that they've got an established track record, being able to predict, and they're beginning to have an ache in the right elbow, and this means. And I'm kind of joking around a little bit here, but seriously, if
right.
you can get a
High-pitched
predictor,
tones. Yeah.
yeah, it's good. You know that some of these biggies, like San Francisco had one in 1906, and we go back. That there's a very interesting pattern going back through history that every 3,600 years there seems to be some humongous cataclysm. And this is in the geological record, and it's matched by folklore, etc. And this is interesting because Zacharias Sitchin translated ancient Sumerian information, and they claimed that every 3,600 years there was a rogue planet that flew by and caused this kind of stuff. So that's what the ancient Sumerians felt. But there is indeed this track record. Take, for instance, when the volcanic island of Thera blew up in the Mediterranean. This is now known as Santorini, and it used to be known as Thera, Thera, but now, there's nothing but a big hole and a little fringe of islands in the water. It's a lovely place to live now. But of course everybody died. It was huge. This was supposed to be 4 to 5 times the Krakatoa explosion in 1883. That's how big it was. And when Krakatoa went, people could, they heard this, I guess, thousands of miles away, and it was like immense, right? This Mediterranean explosion in the volcanic island of Thera was equivalent to several hundred atomic bombs. And it's estimated with carbon dating to be 1628 before Christ, which is approximately 3,643 years ago. Mm-hmm. So that's carbon dating. Now, people say, well, a little bit this way, a little bit that way, but 1628 is in the middle of the range that people argue about. So that's one. Now, this particular story happens about the time of the Jewish Exodus, when the Red Sea parted supposedly, and Moses wandered in the valley of death, for 40 years, gray, volcanic dust everywhere, and for some reason, the Egyptians let all the Jews escape. Now, mind you, this was a slave class that they had, but the little old ladies and the toddlers and the lame, they all walked away, from the Egyptians, because the Egyptians seemed to be discombobulated. Something happened. So there's a lot of argument about whether or not this was, in fact, that related to that volcanic explosion in the Mediterranean, because people argue dates. But dates require that you have a record keeper who's steady, right? Steady. Now, Egypt used to keep the census, and they had who owns, the king, how many geese or how many baskets of grain or whatever. Well, the census just went away. Now, why would that stop? But if the census went away and the slaves walked away and everybody was that confused, nobody's keeping track of tick mark, another year has gone by. So we don't really know, when all this happens, according to Egyptian. But there is a match in the book of Exodus and particular Egyptian records known as the Colbrin, which was secreted away in Scotland and then taken to New Zealand, and so it's intact. And this is also matched by a papyrus written by an Egyptian guy, Ipuwer, I-P-U-W-E-R, and this was found, and they all match. They say the same thing is going on, So anyway, I'd like to just read a quote from the Colbrin.
Sure.
And if this doesn't sound like a big volcanic eruption, I don't know what, right? The darkness was not the clean blackness of night, but a thick darkness in which the breath of men was stopped in their throats. Men gasped in a hot cloud of vapor which enveloped all the land and snuffed out oil and lamps. Men lost their senses and became mad. The habitations of men collapsed upon those inside. The temples and palaces of the nobles were thrown down from their foundations. Men rose up against those in authority and fled from the cities to dwell in tents on the outlands. Egypt lacked great men to deal with the times. The slaves left. Their multitude moved in the gloom of a half-dawn under a mantle of fine, swirling gray dust. Pharaoh abandoned his hopes and fled into the wilderness. Well, now there you are, and that would likely be the aftermath of that big explosion in the Mediterranean. 3,600. That's signature.
So that'd be the volcano that we were speaking of, Thera, which was later renamed to Santorini, which is now an archipelago, which means it's a big hole in the ocean where it just exploded, and it was a season ender, as we call in the disaster business. It really stopped everything for a while and probably contributed to that. You notice that the census stopped in Egypt, and also coincides with that same time period as some of the dark ages worldwide, where a lot of history was not being recorded, probably because the people of that time were busy dealing with the situation they were in, such as the darkness and the ash and the earth changes as far as earthquakes go and volcanoes and probably sinkholes at that time too. Say what you will about the Bible, but it is a historical account of people's experiences put into a book. I can say that, pretty confidently, and that there's different variations of the interpretation of those, but when you match it up with the Kolbrin, which is Egyptian, as you said, I believe, and that's what the quote was from the Kolbrin, Nancy?
Correct. That was from the Kolbrin. And back then, the Jews were forbidden from writing anything that was a lie, from making up fantasies. And the Egyptians were known for their impeccable recording of history and the like. Both of these, and they both match, and that's what's so impressive. Yes. So there's another 3,600-year signature, and that's the frozen mammoth. Do you remember the Discovery Channel having a frozen mammoth and a baby or whatever that they would find up in northern Finland or up in Siberia or various places? And it was flash frozen because the eyeballs were still intact. And they could determine what the animal had eaten. They had buttercups and green grass in their tummies. And I got to tell you, buttercups and green grass don't grow up there in where they were found in Siberia. Wrangle Island is one of the places. It's up in the polar circle. And it was known for just immense amounts of ivory, where it was, they would just pull it out of the permafrost, just because the animals died suddenly, drowned or froze to death or whatever. Well, what did they eat? I mean, these were elephants. These were herbivores. They had to have tons of vegetation.
Right. They're huge eaters because they're such big animals to keep an animal that large. I mean, they're large as elephants of today, if not larger in size, maybe 20% larger. But what they found in northern Finland and also towards into the Siberian area is woolly mammoths, fully preserved in permafrost. Not that it happened over years, because it can't, because the body would decay, the skin and all of the organics of the animal would decay over time from natural erosion and things of that nature, and animals picking at it. But it was so quick that these things happened. That's what stunned scientists. They found like buttercups and other organic materials in the stomachs of these animals that were very recent. Like, it just hit them. They were eating and boom. They got knocked down, it got really cold, and they got flash frozen, and it was very quick. And this was on a 3,600-year signature, which is interesting, and it's in an area that is still frozen. So,
yes, it is now. That has been ever since. And they estimate that the last of the mammoths died out around 3,700 years ago, and or 3,800, 3,700, yeah, on Wrangle Island. And here again, we're doing carbon dating or whatever, and none of this is all that precise, but it's a good guide. And they also estimate that the mammoths arrived at Wrangle Island 7,400 years ago. Well, guess what? Take 3,600 by 2, and you have 7,200. They're both increments of 3,600. So something was in place, two jumps back, 7,200, to allow them to go to the island. And then they must have gotten trapped by water there. And then, another 3,600 years, and whoops, it became part of the polar circle. Well, this is a quote from GeoCities, which the link is now dead, but they did a lot of good studies, and it's very brief. Wrangle Island is 120 miles off the coast of Siberia. Fossil remains of 6-foot-tall, 2-ton woolly mammoths found there have been carbon dated to only 3,700 years ago. The carbon dating of the fossil remains indicates the mammoths lived on Wrangle Island from 7,390 before the present. So there you are. It's a two times 3,600 signature. Plate movement is implied because the mammoths were herbivores, and in order for there to be grass growing, and this relates to the fact that Greenland is so heavy with ice.
Right.
Potsdam University cites that the Earth tilt changed. Potsdam is in Germany, 3,600 years ago. And here's a quote from Climate Arc on that. The great grasslands of North Africa turned to desert a few thousand years ago, 4,000 to 3,600 years ago, according to a paper published today by the journal Geophysical Research. German's Potsdam University Institute for Climate Impact Research analyzed computer models over the past several thousand years. They concluded that the change to today's desert climate in the Sahara was triggered by changes in the Earth's orbit and the tilt of the Earth's axis. And they come right out and say they think that Greenland was the former North Pole, and it's now tilted forward. And that's why there is so much ice there. It's huge. So if you think about that, take a globe in your hands and pull and put Greenland back where it was. Wrangle Island and Siberia were much more in the southern area at that time then. Pull it forward to where Greenland is where it is now, and whoops, Wrangle Island moves up into the polar circle, and there you are. So something happens that impacts the tilt of the globe every 3,600 years, and there you are.
Yeah, it's interesting that these all line up on that signature, that 3,600-year signature. And granted, Nancy, I just want to say for the record, I mean, we're dealing with 5 to 10 year kind of time frames based on that history. I mean, not current time. We can track geological and seismic events pretty easily now with modern technology and ways of recording things. But back then, we're dealing with, like you said before, carbon dating, and that leaves in kind of a little bit of wiggle room as far as the actual years. That's why we're saying 3,600 instead of 3,650. Nancy, I did find I know that the link that you're referring to about Wrangle Island was not a good link, but I did find another one I posted on the chat room talking about the extinction of the woolly mammoth not being related to inbreeding, and talking about Wrangle Island, 87 miles off the Russian mainland, extinction at 3,600 years ago for the woolly mammoth. That's what they're finding, those particular frozen animals in the permafrost. And also in this article that it's off of io9.com, referring to the migration of the animals to the island and how the island got separated from the mainland due to warming. So
yeah.
That's the 7,200 cycle that we were referring to earlier.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. Yeah, well, you were quick.
I use the universal research tool. It's called Google. Google doesn't sponsor this show. I throw it out there.
Yes, Google is great. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm laughing, but you knew I was going to talk about this before I started flapping my lips here, so you probably looked it up ahead of time.
Well, Nancy, just to be honest, I looked it up as we're going, and I'm having two other conversations. I'm multitasking right here in the USA.
You're impressive.
Yeah, I've had my coffee today.
That always helps.
There are other signatures out there, though, too. I mean, geologically speaking, not just with the woolly mammoths, and the Bible, but there are also signatures in the earth that we can look at, I think. I mean,
yes, I know. I have another good one. Yep, I have another good one. It's right on the edge of my lips here, and it's from Velikovsky. Now, Emanuel Velikovsky, I can't recommend his books enough. Earth in Upheaval is describing what's in the geology of the Earth. And Worlds in Collision, he's recording the myths and the legends, and showing how this all relates. But he's out of print. But if you dig around, you can get it at the library. I think if you dig around, you might be able to find a reprint or something on the web. He's great. He was a peer of Einstein, and when Einstein died, he had one of Velikovsky's books open on his desk. So they were. They were peers. They were respected. This whole thing about the crustal shift that we were talking about, the Wrangle Island, and Greenland moving, as Potsdam University found it did, that was Hapgood's theory, and Hapgood was also somebody that was highly respected by Einstein. And Einstein said that he thought that his theories of crustal movement was the best explanation for the ice ages that he'd heard put forward. So these people are respected, and don't let anyone tell you they're not. In any case, in Velikovsky's book, he found that several scientists found that approximately 3,600 years ago, or 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, because it's a little hard to carbon date beach rocks and when they went dry and when they were last moist. But they found that around the world, that all the shorelines are 18 to 20 feet higher than they were 3,600 years ago or so. And this was determined by there's seashells and the amount of dust on the seashells or the rock, or into caves where the waves might have reached, and all this other kind of stuff. That it was approximately 3,000 to 4,000. That now they're dry, and before they weren't. And reading a brief quote from Velikovsky, he's so poetic. It's just a joy to read him. Daly observed that in a great many places all around the world there is a uniform emergence of the shoreline of 18 to 20 feet. Judging from the condition of beaches, terraces, and caves, the emergence seems to have been simultaneous on every shore. In Daly's opinion, the cause lies in the sinking of the level of all seas on the globe. Daly estimates the sudden drop of ocean level to have occurred some 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. Well, Velikovsky goes on to point out that there's a lot of geological evidence, but I'm just picking a few that are, I thought, rather stunning, all over the world. Now, where did the water go? Where did the water go? If they have crustal movement and the plates are moving, it's possible that there's a big crevasse out there in the Pacific or the Atlantic or something, and the water went down into that, because it had to go somewhere for all the water to drop like that. It's very curious, but there we are. And yeah, go ahead.
I just want to mention real quick that when we're talking about the rise and fall of water and the water level around the Earth, a couple of things jump out at me real quick. A skeptic's eye would say, well, for instance, climate change or global warming, or climate change, however you want to refer to it, as a theory. If all of the water, if we were melting the glaciers and melting the ice caps, if all the water in the world were rising at an equal level, water seeks its own level and wants to be flat as possible on a round Earth, of course. But wouldn't New York City have the same water rise as Australia? or Indonesia, which is having problems with flooding, or even just on our continent itself, Florida, for example. Why is water rising there and not so much in New York City or Nova Scotia? That's one thing that pops out at me. And the second thing that pops out at me about what you're saying about where does the water go is, even if there was a huge upheaval in the crust and the plates, some of the plates rose and some dropped, there is an equilibrium that the plates form. So if, let's say, in the Nepal quake, before the Nepal quake, there was a major landslide in Japan that I believe sank 50 meters and then pushed a little bit of an island up, maybe not 50 meters, maybe it was 50 feet. But that same correlating pressure and movement was shown over in Nepal as well, maybe not in 50 feet. I think it moved the Himalayas raised up the Himalayas up 3 to 10 feet. So that's a huge movement for a piece of rock. But I think what you're getting to is that some of these underwater rifts, such as the Mid-Atlantic Rift, or some of these other big, Marianas Trench is part of that as well. Some of these areas can deform and drop down, and then the water will sink on a world level. I mean, it doesn't go into the core. It just the bottom of the cup that's holding the water, the crust, drops down, and then that lowers the level of the water all over the world. Whereas, some people say it's like climate change. Well, if it is climate change that's causing flooding in Indonesia, shouldn't it be causing flooding in New York City?
Right.
It should.
Right.
But,
Exactly. Yeah, we've got plate movement. The plates are on the move, and you can see, from the earthquakes. If you take a look at earthquake maps, you can see that something happens on one plate, and pretty soon, boom, 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 boom. They affect each other. It's like pieces of puzzle that are loosely fit together, and they bump each other. And yes, indeed, they affect each other. Right. Well, there was something, you're talking about that island off Japan, where we had the Nepal quake, and then, boom, there was a landslide on the coast of Japan that caused it slid under and bumped up, the seafloor, and all of a sudden this little old lady was out there collecting seaweed, and it rose several feet during the time that she was out there collecting, and it hit the press everywhere. It was a curiosity. Well, that very same day, go all the way over to Norway, and Norway had, in one of their fjords, had a peculiar landslide they had no explanation for. And they said, oh my, look at, and the fact that this happened in the same day, boom, 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 all around the world like that, to me, I can see that the plates are pushing each other. So here's another 3,600-year signature, ice ages, where people say, well, at one point, Wisconsin was the North. Well, they don't say it was the North Pole. They say there was this huge ice age over Wisconsin. Oh, no, it was over France. Oh, no, it was over Scandinavia or whatever, and they talk about the ice ages like for some reason, like the day after tomorrow, it got really cold. Well, and it's never explained why this happened, or they theorize about ocean currents or whatever. But in fact, if you go into the Potsdam University studies and Hapgood's theory of sliding crust, if every 3,600 years the crust moves around, then what we have is parts of the globe going up and becoming the North Pole, or the tilt of the globe, changing so that is the case, that it becomes the geographic North Pole, and it's just cold. Well, guess what? University of Toronto found that the sea level rose by 20 meters 14,000 years ago. Rose by 20 meters is 60 feet. That's a big amount, right? Mm-hmm. And they state near the end of the last ice age. Well, guess what? 4 times 3,600 is. It's 14,200. Very close to the 14,000. So here we have the signature again. And I've got one more example that I thought was compelling. It's a very recent. It was in the Daily Mail, and it was talking about what they called extinction caves on the island of Madagascar. And a lot of photos of what people found down there. It was filled with water at the current time. And they found giant lemurs the size of gorillas down there, the skeletons and the like. Well, what they couldn't figure out is how it was that all these giant lemurs were in the cave with predators that had, would hunt them, and everybody was in there, and everybody was dead. It was like they all drowned at the same time, but at the current time, that those caves were above sea level, well above sea level, and it was fresh water, now I think that was filling those caves. So it was like, why are predator and prey in the cave all dead at the same time? Well, Velikovsky has similar examples from around the world. One was from Florida, and another was, I think, in the Mediterranean, where even the bodies of predator and prey that were dead together had drowned and were smashed to bits by pounding waves. And this has a 3,600-year signature. And I just want to read my last quote of the night. The researchers have also discovered the bones from elephant birds, horned crocodiles, rodents, and hippos that roamed the island landscape thousands of years ago. However, most of the species found in the caves are now extinct, and scientists are baffled as to how so many diverse species ended up in one place. Estimated to be between, 3,000 and 4,000 years old. The bones showed hardly any signs of post-death damage like the kind that comes from being eaten by a predator. So there you are, extinction records. Why is the woolly mammoth extinct? It was a very hale animal, and many animals that had become extinct, there didn't seem to be anything wrong with them. But climate change will do that. Imagine around the Arctic. If the Arctic was not up there in the Arctic where the polar bear is, the polar bear is already having problem with the melting ice in the Arctic. But what if it all of a sudden becomes dry land everywhere? Well, they're used to hunting seals, and the like, and they could easily, and also they would be more vulnerable to hunters, if they couldn't run around on the ice, if the hunters could chase them through the bitter, bitter cold. So you can have extinction because sudden climate change will do that.
Right. And these are just more physical evidence of the cycle that we're talking about, the 3,600 years. And you can go back 3-4 cycles up to the, like you said, the 14,000-year mark. I do find it interesting as another example of this extinction, these extinction caves. So you're speaking of Madagascar. I found a link from National Geographic about the lemur extinction caves, and there are no signs of any kind of trauma with these animals. It's almost like they're trying to hide from something, and they weren't being attacked by predators or anything. And then no post-death damage, which means there's no scavengers after that. Small animals will sometimes scavenge and pick at things, and that's not the case either. Also not the case with the woolly mammoths. Nancy, I wanted to break it into we do have a couple of questions from the chat room, primarily of which I know with what you do on a daily basis with your website and with your daily communication on a couple of different social media feeds that come out talking about survivability of some of these changes. And one of the questions from the chat room is how should one prepare to survive such a shift, let's call it a crustal shift of the poles that would create environment, obviously earthquakes and volcanoes initially, but the environment would change for one's particular area. How would one prepare to survive this?
Well, first off, you'd want to figure out what your new climate was going to be like, what the target climate was going to be like. like the guys, Mammoth on Wrangle Island, they thought it was going to be Siberian grass fields, and then it was all ice and snow. So you have to figure out in some manner, and I would, there's prophecy and predictions on my website, thetatalk.com. You can go and check out, and it'll give you your target climate based on best known prophecy and evidence. And then the second thing is prepare for that. Plants are going to be different. What you can grow in Florida today, if your climate is going to be colder, more like Maine, say, you wouldn't want to try and plant all orange trees or something that's going to struggle, try to collect seed and get into plants and gardens for your target climate. Assume, given, poor Moses wandering around in the valley of the shadow of death for 40 years, that a lot of volcanoes will go off, and therefore there will be a lot of volcanic dust and clouds. Now, this doesn't mean you can't grow anything or eat anything. There's all kinds of plants that do very well in dim light. Potatoes do. I have a lot of sheep sorrel in my area, which grows in the shade. Scurvy grass, I think that's from Ireland, very high in vitamin C. So be prepared for low light and mushrooms. Of course, you have mushrooms. Things like that will do well in dim light. The climate, just try to anticipate what it's going to be like and prepare for that and get ready to be out of any building that might fall on you and to live in temporary structures. This would be true no matter what. I have tents at my house for such a emergency, and because we have a marsh nearby, expecting a lot of mosquitoes potentially, I have netting, one of these net tents that people can sit in during the day and get away from the mosquitoes, and this is just something to have handy, and not a lot of money, but I'm telling you, if you have to get out of your house and in anticipation of earthquakes, it's very handy. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, another thing that we've talked on, Nancy, you've been a guest on this show the first Monday of the month for a couple of months, 3 now, and even longer. It's been such a pleasure, I forget. But we did talk about, I'm not sure if it was last episode, about the plate movements, too, that you can kind of look at the history geologically of where you live. Go for a walk, get out into the open, follow the streams and the riverbeds. There's always great scenic walks. Nature preserves, that sort of thing. But look around you. If you see a lot of bluffs or outcroppings of rock that sharply come out of the ground and are very hard rock, such not limestone, but the more of the bedrock, granite and that sort of thing. If you, for example, Nancy, between the border of Wisconsin and Minnesota, for those of you who know, you cross either the Mississippi or the Minnesota River, depending on how far south on the border you cross between Minnesota and Wisconsin. But as you're crossing through those areas, you can see the terrain changing as you're getting closer to the border, that there's more bluffs and outcroppings of rocks and things that jut up. And you can tell as an individual, as an amateur geologist, or if you're just looking at it, that those outcroppings were not cut by river erosion. I mean, some of the bottom of them, they weren't cut by man, and some of the bottom of them were stream cut. But you can see that those are dramatic uplift of rock or changes, that sort of thing. And if you see those things in your area, you can kind of start to do the physicalities of it and say, there has been some movement here before. Maybe I should be prepared for some movement in the future. And having those tents.
The biggie. Yosemite Park, where they have that huge cliff. Does it run like 2,000 feet just straight down? I mean, that sheer rock. Something broke that rock, and jutted that cliff up. I mean, that's a tremendous force. Well, of course, it's on the west coast. It's a subduction area. One plate is driven under another, during the San Andreas adjustments or whatever, and you can tell that there's going to be rumpling. It's going to be rock and roll in that area. You can look at the rock strata also. Go on, Google it, and take a look, and you can see, where quakes have happened in the past, or even just see on the earthquake maps, they have all these purple dots showing you where the quakes have been over the past year or two or whatever. You can see where the purple lines, the dots are. It's clear where there is distress in the rock strata. And then, of course, there's things like subduction and one plate driving under another and mountain building happening, or something pulling apart, like the New Madrid adjustment, is ripping the plate apart to some degree, pulling it at a diagonal. You can literally palpate that if you look at this, the geology of the Earth.
Yeah, the history is written in the rock.
Yes, it is.
And sometimes in the fossils, it's written in the fossils, it's written in the rock, and if we're lucky, it got written down by humans, which we do have those references too. I just want to make a couple references to the names on the research that we quoted here. The Kolbrin is an Egyptian text, correct?
Yes.
Or Kolbrin, Kolbrin.
That is correct. That is correct. Yeah.
And the other reference you had was
Velikovsky, 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 right.
Okay. Great. And your website, if anybody wants more information about safe locations, you can definitely check out zetatalk.com. That's ZETATALK.com, or the sister site to that, which is more concentrated on current Earth changes, is called poleshift.ning.com. And that's
right.
Those are great resources for finding out what's currently going on, and also some great resources as well for finding out what has happened in the past.
Yep, so true.
Nancy, thank you so much for being on the show again. It's always enlightening to have you here. We've got a very active chat room on the live show, and a lot of folks in the chat room want to say thank you as well. So great job explaining everything. And your movie review, it's a thumbs up on San Andreas?
Oh, big time. Go see
Good.
that movie. You won't regret it.
Probably.
Lots of lessons. Yeah. Good
Great.
educational.
Very good. I just want to thank you personally for being on the show, and for those of you out there who want to check out the website, again, you can check our website out at usaebn.org, zetatalk.com, and poleshift.ning.com for the Earth changes. And Nancy, always a pleasure to have you on the show.